Everybody, I was at the debate last night. I was in the actual room with the candidates, observing the festivities or the clown show or whatever word you want to use that's pejorative. I would basically agree with. Maybe the funniest part was when NBC had a technical meltdown. When you were sitting there in the debate hall, you were hearing weird echoes and misplaced microphone signals. It was hard to tell exactly what was going on. There was just like all of a sudden a lot of weird ambient noise. Um, and then finally, Rachel and Chuck had to intervene and declare that a commercial break was required to remediate the situation. Anyway, you'll notice that the one candidate who got an overtly negative question was Tulsi. And I say overtly negative in the sense that the one candidate for whom some past liability was dredged up and formulated into a specific question was Tulsi, and that was Chuck Todd asking her about her anti-LGBT comments from 15 plus years ago, some of which were from when she was literally a teenager. Chuck Todd saw fit to raise that issue with her on a national debate stage, which was the first time that millions of Americans were exposed to her. One of the things they were exposed to is that she made anti-LGBT comments when she was a teenager, and she's thoroughly explained her evolution on that. She's given what I think is a very compelling and sincere explanation for why she shed the views that she was inculcated with as a child, and once she gained life experience and a broader perspective, she changed her mind, like many people who grow up in a sort of overweening, socially conservative household with a domineering father, in particular, in her case. So I have no problem making candidates answer tough questions about their past statements and their past liabilities, but no other candidate was asked about anything that happened that long ago, and no candidate was made to account for a somewhat superficial, quote, liability they have, even though I could have given you 1,000 different questions to pose to Cory Booker, to Amy Klobuchar, to any of them. And yet that all was ignored, and the only one who got a question of that kind was Tulsi. So what does that tell you? Well, it's nothing new for NBC News. NBC News, as you might recall, on the day of Tulsi's formal announcement speech in Hawaii in February, they timed a piece to publish on that very day. It was a Saturday, so not a typical day when pieces like this would get published, but they timed a piece to coincide with her announcement that basically claimed that she was being supported by the Russian interference botnet. And that piece was totally pathetic. It was reliant on a discredited cybersecurity firm called New Knowledge, which does this opaque and basically garbage analysis of online social media activity, and then tries to attribute that to Russia as a whole, and therefore they were trying to cast Tulsi as somehow a stooge or a pawn of Russia. So that's what NBC News has done in the past, so it's not surprising that they would have been extra antagonistic toward Tulsi, or at least tried to portray her in the most negative possible light. But I thought she comported herself mostly pretty well. She's at her best when she's in extemporaneous exchanges with others, or when she's a little bit off the talking points. And it's understandable that in a debate where you're being introduced to millions of Americans for the first time, you'd want to just do a basic introduction, which goes through, who you are, what your basic positions are as a candidate. So I thought it was pretty notable that when she was asked to comment on the gender pay gap, she basically ignored that and launched into a disquisition on her overall campaign philosophy, which is that None of the domestic priorities, policy-wise, that people want to implement that are progressive or left-wing or however you want to characterize them, that can't be disentangled from America's role in the world, which is belligerent and wasteful. So that's what Tulsi outlined in response to an economics question about the gender pay gap, because she's saying that economic considerations have to be viewed as inextricably linked with what goes on in the foreign policy realm. So, I mean, I think if you never heard of her before, or you only heard of her in passing, to get a synthesis of her beliefs in that format was useful. Because her main priority, I think, was just getting exposure that being on a televised debate affords. Therefore, she didn't really interject in some portion of the debate like other candidates did. It's kind of not her temperamental style, really, to do that, to interrupt and such. Although I think there were points that she could have interjected with useful contributions. I'm thinking of the immigration part where she was totally excluded. She probably, if she had interjected, would have brought in the foreign policy dimension, whereby the U.S. policy of interventionism has caused, or at least has contributed to, the destabilization of Central American countries like Guatemala, Honduras, and so forth, which has led to the migrant influx coming from the south to the border with Mexico. And she's discussed that in the past. But, she didn't interject, and I think, there are upsides and downsides to not interjecting. I thought, John Delaney's interjections were just totally insufferable. Maybe it's because I don't find him appealing at all. But he just seems like an inconsequential dope to me. So his interjections were really forced and almost whiny. And I think there is a danger of coming across that way if you try to be too assertive in jumping in to the debate. I thought, arguably de Blasio's interjections actually were decent in terms of making somewhat substantive points and getting his views out there, although de Blasio totally beclowned himself during the lightning round session or whatever when he said that the greatest threat to America is Russia because, Russia's interfering with their, dastardly Facebook memes and Twitter bots and such. Some other observations, I sat there for watching the debate with the Gravel teens, who were hilarious. I mean, they're really smart, they're really savvy, quote unquote. They were tweeting the entire time under Mike Gravel's name, and they're like 18 and 19-year-old kids, basically. But, they know what they're talking about. And they were being followed around by this documentary crew. So basically everything that they said or did was being recorded. And they even got to meet Tulsi later on the night, and I watched them interact. That was interesting. Mike Gravel said that he will endorse Bernie, Tulsi, or Warren. Maybe all three, maybe some combination, who knows. So the teens are favorably disposed to Tulsi, although they would have liked her to interject more and to be a little more forceful, which, if you're a Tulsi supporter, I can see why you might want that, but you have to recognize that the audience is not you. That's a pretty small niche at this point. The audience is the broad swath of Americans who've probably never heard of her, and if they have, only in passing, or they don't know anything about her. So, you got to weigh the different considerations there. As far as the other candidates, I think Booker did the most obvious pander, where he shouted out the Senate candidate running for the Democrats in South Carolina, which, obviously is to ingratiate himself with the South Carolina Democratic establishment, which is where he feels he needs to do well in order to win. Klobuchar, I don't find anything about her even that remarkable at all, so I don't even remember what she said, really. I know she made a joke about Trump that, people laughed at or whatever. What else? I mean, I think the exchange that Tulsi had with Tim Ryan was her strongest point, and Tim Ryan made himself look like a total idiot. I mean, how could you not know at this point, or how could you not at least be clear that you know that Al-Qaeda and the Taliban are separate forces in Afghanistan? And anyway, the Taliban that exists now bears almost no relation to the Taliban that existed in 2001 when the United States invaded. The Taliban, as Tulsi pointed out accurately, existed prior to the U.S. invading and will exist after the U.S. leaves, whenever that happens, which may never happen. And it'll never happen, probably, if people like Tim Ryan get into power, where they're saying we need to maintain basically permanent presences in these overseas conflicts, including Afghanistan, because of X, Y, and Z. I kind of had the sense that Tim Ryan had a little bit of a faulty grasp of foreign affairs, given my conversation with him that I posted on this channel 2 days ago, I think, that I from my exchange with him in South Carolina, where he basically called for a new Cold War with Russia, and he actually used that terminology. So I was not surprised that he kind of whiffed pretty dramatically on the Afghanistan exchange with Tulsi. But that's the exchange that I think her campaign is promoting the most, and that was where she comported herself the best. When she does the standard talking points, it can come off as a tad stilted at times. So I think she ought to strive to be a little more extemporaneous, you know. But overall, I thought it was good. And, you know, what else? I mean, it's funny. Warren obviously was being promoted at the beginning, where she got most of the questions at the outset. And that's the most important part of the debate, because that's when most people are watching, when the debate first comes on. So a certain segment of the viewership tunes out over the course of 2 hours. So for NBC to consciously basically elevate her as the most important candidate shows their bias, and not biased in a necessarily insidious way, but it just shows that they were biased toward promoting her, because she happened to be at the center of the stage, although Beto was as well. And to have the idea that he's a center stage candidate is itself dubious. Obviously, the other candidates are annoyed with Beto, or as annoyed with Beto as the media Twitter world seems to be, which is why Castro went after him, de Blasio went after him. Whether that translates into Beto sinking, I don't know. But he's already sunk somewhat, so whatever. You might not. I don't think anybody really saw this if you were watching at home. But about 2 minutes before the debate went on air, some guy emerged from the background of the set and ran out on stage with the candidates, and everyone's like, "What? How did that happen?" It looked almost like the guy had been hiding in the decorative background or something, and got on stage with the candidates. And who knows what that guy would have done? I mean, kind of a security lapse, you'd think. So that's just a basic recap. I'm going to have a piece out on this a little bit later today that's pretty short, just kind of some basic takeaways. It's not published right now, but I will put that into the YouTube description box when it comes out, which is hopefully be in like an hour or two or something from when this gets published. So, and I'll tweet it out, of course. If you want to support my going around to these events, giving you my observations, talking to candidates, producing written journalism and video journalism and audio journalism and all the other stuff that I do, again, please consider a financial contribution through PayPal or Patreon. That information is all in the description box as usual. And subscribe to the podcast, iTunes and Stitcher. Subscribe here on YouTube. I'm going to have a podcast, which is a longer version of a debate recap that incorporates what happens tonight. I'll put that out Friday morning or afternoon. So that said, I will talk to you later. Bye-bye from Miami, where it's really hot, but that's okay.